Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 191 for the 2nd of Sivan in a leap year. So one time, when I was visiting my brother on Shabbos in Passaic, New Jersey, I think I've mentioned that I've visited him and his family before, I was talking to one of my nephews, not the nephew who came up with Zeno's paradox. Go refer to previous episode for that one. But this time it was a different nephew. And he was pretty young at the time. I want to say he was around like 6 years old. And we were having a conversation about the dynamics of the family. And I was trying to explain to him that, he sees me a lot. I come to visit every so often. And he knows me as Auntie Sarid, so I'm his aunt. And so at some point, I was trying to explain to him that not only am I his aunt, but I'm actually his father's sister. And not only am I his father's sister, but I'm actually his bubby's child. And his bubby is my mother. And so it was really funny. It was a really cute conversation, like this whole trying to explain to him the interplay of the family and the family map. And he was just floored. He could not grapple with this. He couldn't wrap his head around this. How Auntie Sarid, who he knows me as, is also his father's sister. Like, this just did not make any sense to him. It was like blowing his mind. It was blowing his world. And he was trying to understand it, how he has brothers and sisters and how his father could also have a brother and a sister. And this incident came to mind when I was learning and thinking about today's Tanya. Because in today's Tanya, we're going to be learning all about how with each descent of God's light and God's Shechina, which we've discussed, which is the way that God interacts with the world and relates to the world, that world which it's found in can only relate to God on that level and has really no awareness of the level which is above it. So maybe to make this even more relatable, I want you guys to think of a time when you were really young. Maybe go back to like the earliest moments in your childhood that you can remember, and think about a caregiver. Think about your mother, your father, maybe a grandparent, somebody who you were very close with. And see if you can think about what your perception of them was at that time. So let's say like your mother, for example, if that was somebody that you were very close with. So most likely at that time, to you, your mother was merely just your mother. You had zero sense of the fact that she had her own identity, that she had her own interests, that she had her own friends, that she had her own mother. Just like my nephew was having a hard time understanding even that his bubby is my brother's mother. Like even that was kind of like a leap of understanding for him. So when we're young, when we're really little, we see adults, especially the adults that are close to us in our lives, especially our caretakers, as in this very self-centered way. We see them merely as in terms of their role, in terms of us. We don't realize that perhaps they have relationships with other people. Perhaps they have a profession. Perhaps they have their own relationships with other members of their family that we don't really know. And they have a whole history. Perhaps they were once young like us. Like these things don't occur to us, and it's really hard for us to understand this. So the way that this relates to the Tanya, and today is going to be a bit of a longer one, and it's also going to give us, there's going to be a lot of mapping going on, of understanding how the descent of the worlds happen and all of that. But the core theme, or at least the theme that I took away from the Tanya for today, is exactly this idea of God's Shechina and what that means in terms of every world. And we know that God's Shechina, in its highest form, is what we refer to as Malchus of Atzilus. So what that means in simple language is Malchus is the lowest of all the spheres. It's the lowest of all the 10 attributes. It literally means kingship. And Atzilus is the highest of all the worlds. It's that world of emanation, which is kind of like the pristine, archetypical world from which everything else comes out of. So what that really means to say is that Shechina, when we talk about Shechina, when we talk about God's indwelling here in this world, God's relationship with us, the best way to understand this is in terms of relating to God as a king. So just like in the case of caretakers, just like in the case of our mother, our father, our grandparents, whatever it is, as young children, we only saw them as our caretaker and we were incapable of seeing them in this bigger way. That's really how a king works, if you think about it. So if you have a king, or nowadays it's like we don't really have kings in the same way. And even like presidents and everything, we know too much about the personal lives of our leaders really to help us respect them. But if you could imagine like a state of like a true king, maybe a Rebbe, maybe those of you that had a relationship or have a relationship with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, or maybe another Rebbe or another mentor that you have, your relationship with them is really this kingship about them, this regalness. This is how they relate to you. This is your experience of them. You experience them as a king, in spite of the fact that truly this king may have a whole life that is not only about you. So yes, they are able to vest themselves and become a king and totally devote themselves to you 100%, so that your entire relationship with them is going to be that of a king. But there's this whole hidden world inside of the king that you know nothing about. Just like when it came to your mother, hopefully, if you had a good upbringing, she was 100% devoted to you. Her whole life was you, really, or maybe her other children as well. But nevertheless, that doesn't take away from the fact that she had her own inner life. She had a whole world, or has a whole world, that's really concealed from you. So this is what we're going to be learning about today, is about this whole process, of God and specifically God's kingship, and this attribute of God's kingship and what that means exactly, and how it translates and how it descends from world to world, and how each world's perception of God's kingship, what that looks like exactly, depending on the world that it's in. So I think we should get straight into the text and explain as we go, because it is a longer section today, as I mentioned, and I think we can discuss and get deeper into these whole ideas as we get into it. So for context, we are still in the middle of chapter 52 of Likkutei Amarim, and so here we go. So the Alter Rebbe begins by referencing where we left off last time, how Hashem's wisdom descends from level to level through different worlds, progressively becoming more hidden along the way until it is able to become vested here in our world. So now the Alter Rebbe picks up from there, and he says that just as this wisdom comes down and goes from world to world, so too does the Shechina, which again, if you recall, the Shechina, which is vested within this will and wisdom of God, it descends as well, and from world to world. And so now here's some terminology for you guys. You might want to take notes for this episode, because there's going to be kind of like this like spiritual map that we're drawing up, is that this descent of the Shechina from world to world, what this is called the chamber of the Holy of Holies. And we'll learn further what that means. So, and what we're referring to. So then now the Alter Rebbe here quotes cites the Zohar and the Eitz Chaim, which are two Kabbalistic Sfarim, and which explain that the Shechina, another way that we can understand the Shechina, is that it's Malchus of Atzilus. So what does that mean? So here again, so there's a few maps that I want you guys to keep in mind, and a lot of this are things that we've been over before, but I'll just give a really brief review, especially if any of you are like newer listeners. So there's the map of the different levels of different types of worlds. So in general, there are 4 spiritual worlds. There's the world of Atzilus is the highest, the world of Bria below it, then the world of Yetzirah, and then the world of Asiya below that, which is the world we live in. In brief, loosely translated, Atzilus means emanation, Bria, the next one, means creation, Yetzirah means formation, and Asiya means action. So those are the 4 general worlds, and we'll learn that there's actually like a lot of other like sub worlds within those like myriads upon myriads of subworlds, but those are the general worlds. Within each world are contained what are known as the spheros. The spheros are like the spiritual energies, kind of like, it's hard to translate exactly, like spheres or energies, kind of. Within human being, we have 10 energies within us or 10 attributes that correspond to these 10 energies. And those 10 energies are divided into the first 3, which are Chochmah, Bina, Das. Those are the intellectual energies or the intellectual attributes. And then there's the 6 emotive attributes, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. And then there's the last one, which is Malchus, and that one is sometimes put in the category of the emotive attributes, but it's kind of its own thing, as we'll see, because it's sort of like the expression of all of them. So Malchus is really all about expression. It's likened to speech because of that. It's sort of like the ultimate manifestation of all these other attributes, which the other ones are a little bit more like inwards, and Malchus is the most outwards. It's the outward expression of all of it. Malchus literally means kingship or sovereignty. So it makes sense in terms of what we were talking about in the introduction, that Malchus is all about what gets revealed, what people who relate to it see, is that they see king. This is what they see. They don't see all the inner workings and thoughts and feelings of the king. They just see the king in terms of like how he's relating to them. So let's get back to the text. So then the Alter Rebbe here. So Malchus of Atzilus. So again, so Shechina, Malchus of Atzilus, synonymous. So we've been talking a lot about the Shechina. Now we can understand a little bit more what that means. And so then the Alter Rebbe says that this aspect, saying that it's Malchus of Atzilus, this means, what does this mean when we say Malchus of Atzilus? It means that it's the revelation of the Or Ein Sof Baruch Hu. It's the revelation of God's infinite light and the vitality that radiates into all the worlds. So, because God's infinite light is found in Atzilus, because it's the world of emanation where there's no difference between God and everything else. So the revelation of this infinite light, the manifestation of that, is in the Malchus of that world. And this is why it's also called, this Malchus of Atzilus is called Dvar Hashem, which is the word of God or God's speech, or it's also called Ruach Piv, Kivechol. So it's also called like the spirit of God, so to speak. The spirit of God's mouth, so to speak. So it's like the words that God's speaking. And then the Alter Rebbe says this is like, we can understand this by way of analogy with a person, that when a person speaks, what is speech? Speech, like physical human speech, is we're revealing what it is that we're thinking in a concealed way. So anytime we speak, like right now I'm talking, the only way that I'm able to say these words is because I'm thinking about them on some level inside of my brain. And so now what happens is that you have this Malchus of Atzilus, so it's the lowest level of that world, of that highest world of Atzilus. And then this level of Malchus of Atzilus, otherwise known as the Shechina, becomes vested in what is known as the chamber of Holy of Holies of the next world, which is Bria. So what is this obscure chamber of Holy of Holies, the Heichal Kodesh Kadoshim in Hebrew? This is the Chochmah Bina Das of Bria. This is the 3 intellectual attributes of Bria. This is the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, loosely translated, of Bria. And then what happens is that this energy, these intellectual attributes, this like vestment of the Shechina in the Heichal Kodesh Kadoshim, otherwise known as the Chabad of Bria, these then become vested in the Malchus of Bria, which is that lowest level of Bria, right? The kingship of Bria. And from there are created the souls and the angels that are found in Bria, as well as the Talmud, which we know of. So when we study Talmud down here, this Talmud originates in this Malchus of Bria, within which is vested the Chabad of Bria, which is coming from the Malchus of Atzilus, if that makes sense. So it's like this, you can try to keep that map in mind. Again, sometimes it might be useful. I actually drew a little like chart for myself as I was preparing for this class to see the flow of how this all works. And then the Alter Rebbe says that this is explained in the Tikkunim, how it is that the Talmud comes from this place of Malchus of Bria. So why is it? Why that sounds kind of random. It's like the Talmud comes from there. Why? So the Tikkunim explains that the idea, the world of Bria, what happens in the world of Bria is that is the place where the radiance, there's a radiance and there's an influx of the Chokhmah, Bina, and Das of the Ein Sof Baruch Hu, of God, by way of a great symptom, a great contraction, in order so that the souls and the angels that are there, that are finite and that are limited in scope, they can receive, so that they can receive this influence in a way of Chokhmah, Bina, and Das. So basically, it's like, the way to understand this is that each world sort of has its like specialty. It's like sort of like, this is the place where this part of God radiates, this aspect of God radiates. So the world of Bria is the place where the radiance of God's Chabad, God's intellect, is revealed, radiates, albeit in a very, very constricted place. And that's why, continues the Alter Rebbe, this is why the Talmud comes from there. Because the Talmud also relates to this idea of the Chokhmah Bina Das, of the Chabad. Why? Because what is the Talmud? The Talmud is the reasons behind the halachos. So when we learn different like Jewish law, like for those of you that have ever studied Talmud even a little bit, or had a sense of what it's all about, the Talmud is all about this like back and forth of trying to understand Jewish law, trying to understand the reasons behind them, trying to understand what's going on, really understanding the reasons behind the mitzvahs, behind the Jewish law. And so this idea of the reasons, understanding reasons, this is an intellectual pursuit. So this is the aspect of Chokhmah, Bina, and Das. This is the aspect of the Chabad. By contrast, if we actually look at the Jewish laws themselves, those are not intellectual aspects. Like, it's not like law, like just like the bare bones halacha. There's nothing intellectual about it. It just like is what it is, right? So where does that come from? The halachos come from the midos of Hashem, from the emotive attributes of God, of the Ein Sof Baruch Hu, which are chesed, din, rachamim. So again, we talked about chesed, gvura, tiferes, netzach, chod yesod. So the manifestation of these in terms of like emotive attributes and the way they get expressed is through kindness, chesed, din, severity, mercy, rachamim. And so this is why, like, what is this all about? How do we see that the halachas come from this more emotive kind of place? Because we see that actually, what are halachas? What are they all about? They're all about saying this is permissible, this is forbidden, this is kosher, this is pasul, like not allowed. This person is chayav to do a mitzvah. This person is patur from doing a mitzvah. Like, they're obligated and held accountable for doing a mitzvah, or in some cases, we're not held accountable for doing a mitzvah, and we kind of, there's a loophole where we don't actually have to do it. All those different laws, So if you think about it, it makes sense that the halachos come from this more emotional space of like more giving, like more being permissible kind of thing. And yes, it's allowed, versus saying, no, it's not allowed, and like holding back. So that's why the halachos come from this place. And then the Alter Rebbe says that this is what is written, this is explained in the Tikkunim, in the Tikkunei Zohar. So now we're going to go back to our map. So if you remember, so far, what we had so far is we had the Malchus of Atzilus, right? Which we also call the Shechina, which is also called the Dvar Hashem, like the speech of God. And that becomes expressed in Bria as the Heichal Kodesh Kadoshim, the Chamber of Holies of Bria, otherwise known as the Chabad of Bria. And then that Chabad of Bria becomes vested within the Malchus of Bria, that lowest level of Bria, the sovereignty of Bria. And that manifests as the Talmud, and also the angels and the souls that are found in Bria. So then what happens? So then, now we're in that realm of the Malchus of Bria. So what happens is that then it descends even further. It goes, this Malchus of Bria, just like the Malchus of Atzilus descended and became the Chamber of Holies of Bria, the Malchus of Bria now becomes the Chamber of Holies of Yetzirah. And what is the Chamber of Holies of Yetzirah? So if you've been following along, maybe let's see if I'll give you guys a second to try to piece it. What would be a synonym for the Chamber of Holies of Yetzirah? Okay. It would be the Chokhmah Bina Das, the Chabad of Yetzirah. So again, if you want to kind of make a little map here, Chamber of Holies, or Heichal Kodesh Kadoshim, equals Chabad of whatever world we're talking about. So then what happens is that now we're in the world of Yetzirah. So in that world of Yetzirah, the world of formation, so the Chabad of Yetzirah then gets vested in the Malchus of Yetzirah, in that lowest level of Yetzirah. And what happens in this Malchus of Yetzirah? So this is where we see that the different spirits and the different angels of Yetzirah are formed and manifest. So you're probably seeing a pattern at this point that what happens, the Malchus of each world is where the creation actually happens, where the souls and the angels and whatever's going on in that world gets generated from. And then all the other stuff before that is like sort of like preparatory steps. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on, not only are the angels and the souls of Yetzirah formed here, but also this is actually where we get our Mishnah. What is the Mishnah? So the Mishnah is it's a composite of all the different halachos, all the different laws, Jewish laws. And then the Alter Rebbe says that this Jewish law, they also come from the Chochmah Bina Das of God. It also comes from God's intellect. So God, when we learn about different Jewish law, these are laws that God came up with, so to speak, in his mind. However, in this case, the Chabad that we're talking about, the intellect that we're talking about, is not about the idea of the reasons behind the halachos. We're not getting into when we just study bare basic Jewish law, like if you open up like a book of halacha, you're not necessarily learning the reasons behind the halachos. That's not what it's about. The reasons behind the halachos are actually hidden within the body of the halachos themselves, and it's not revealed. The actual body of the halachos and the actual revealed halachos, these are actually a manifestation of the midos, of the emotive attributes of God in a way of revelation. As we explained previously in the name of the Tikkunim, that in the Tikkunei Zohar, there's a phrase that says, Shit Sfiran Mekanenin Be'etzira, which means that the 6 spheros, the 6 midos, the 6 emotive attributes, they nest in Yetzirah. So it's like they're nesting, their home is in Yetzirah. So we talked about this just before, that basically just like every world has its like specialty, so to speak, and it's like this is where what part of God's manifestation is revealed here. So in the world of Bria, what's revealed and what's manifest and what that whole world is all about is about God's intellect, about God's Chabad, which is why that's where the Talmud comes from, because the Talmud is all about the reasoning and the standings, like the why of the mitzvahs. Versus when we get into the world of Yetzirah, the world right below that, that's the world of the emotive attributes. That's the world of emotion, of God's emotions being manifest. And so that's why it makes sense that this would be the world of Mishnah or the world of halachos, because these are an expression of God's emotions, God's likes and dislikes, so to speak. So basically, because if you really break down what is halacha is all about like what you can do, what you can't do. So it's like what makes God happy, what does not make God happy. So it's like, and there's an aspect of like the right side, which is the aspect of like being makol, like being more permissible, which basically what that means is like when you say that something is permissible, we're allowed to do something, it means that we're opening it up, that we're saying that this thing can be elevated up to God. Or to be machmir. Machmir is to be stringent, and that's like the opposite. Like when we're stringent about something, when we say like, no, that's not allowed, we're basically stating that this thing cannot be elevated up to God in the same way. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that all of this, whether we're talking about the Talmud or the Mishnah, it's all coming from the high supernal chokhmah of Atzilus, and as well as the Bina and Das that's contained within it. So we can look at this map in like a way of descent. Like we can look at how like from world to world, like going from the Malchus of one world becomes the Chabad of the next world, and so on and so forth. And there's like this direct chain of rolling over. Like it's like a snowball that's like just going and going and going. But that initial snowball is always still there. So that it's like if we revert back to the beginning, it's all originating from the same place. And all of these things are really originating in God's mind. Because just like the Malchus of every world, like when we were talking about the Malchus of Bria, remember that was vesting the Chabad of Bria. And so too with Yetzirah. So then where we started from the Malchus of Atzilus. So we have to say that vested within that world of Malchus of Atzilus is also the Chabad of that world, right? So then we say, okay, so everything's coming from that Chabad of Atzilus. And what is Chabad of Atzilus? Chabad of Atzilus is actually totally unified with God. Because if you remember, the world of Atzilus is really unique in that sense that it's not separate from God the way the other worlds are separate from God. But what the Alter Rebbe is really teaching us here is, as separate as Atzilus is, as different as it is, it's actually totally connected with all the other worlds, which means that if we, on a true sense, even though it's not revealed as such to us, but when we understand how unified all these attributes are with God and Atzilus, and then when we understand that there's this direct chain and this direct link when it comes down to us, we can actually see that in all the worlds, there's this unification with God. And it's with perfect unity, like totally, totally unified. So whether we're talking about the Talmud or whether we're talking about the Mishnah, all of these things contain within them that unity with God. Like they're totally unified with God the same way that the world of Atzilus is unified with God. And so what's really happening is when we go back to our original, where we're all coming from, like bring it back home, is the Shechina. The Shechina again is that indwelling of God. That is the way that God relates to the world. And so then we can understand that the whole time this Shechina is descending in this whole process. And so now the Alter Rebbe is going on with the map, and he says that in this likewise manner, so now we're in that world of Yetzirah, right? So then the Shechina goes and descends from the Malchus of Yetzirah and becomes vested within the chamber of Holies of, I'll give you guys a minute to try to think of it, Asiya, that lowest world, our world. So that chamber of Holies of Asiya is Chabad of Asiya, right? So the point is for us to recognize basically that here in our world of Asiya, even though it is the lowest of all worlds and it's the world that reveals God in the least way, nevertheless, the Shechina really is here in our world, and the Alter Rebbe mapped out that process of how it happens. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that these three worlds, the Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, are actually further subdivided into a myriad upon myriad of many other levels that are also called individual worlds. And this Malchus of Atzilus, which is where we all started from, which again is the Shechina, is vested in the Malchus of every single one of these individual worlds and descends from that Malchus of whichever particular world we're talking about, and it descends into the world that is below it, into and becomes vested in the chamber of Holies, which is the Chabad of that world, which is below it in level. And then there's a little note here that the Alter Rebbe adds, and like a little footnote where it says that this is how we can understand the phrase which we say in Tehillim, Malchutcha Malchut Kol Alamim. Your kingdom is the kingdom of all worlds. So now it's like we can have a much deeper appreciation of what that means exactly, that your kingdom is the kingdom of all worlds, that this Malchus of Atzilus, this Hashem Shechina, is literally found within every single one of these worlds. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that from this Shechina, which is vested within the chamber of Holies in every single world, whether we're talking about the general worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, or the individual worlds, like those myriad upon myriad of levels. So from the Shechina is drawn out and spreads out the light and vitality for that particular world and for those particular creations and angels and souls. So if you recall, we mentioned that previously, that like in each world has a certain type of creation that is found within it. Like Yetzirah has its own angels and souls, and Bria has its own angels and souls, and Asiya has its own creations as well. And each one of those are coming from the Malchus of that world, but ultimately we've learned that Malchus of that world comes from the Chabad of that world, which comes from the Malchus of the previous world. So it all descends back to the beginning. And so then the Alter Rebbe concludes, because they all originated in the Asara Mamarot, the 10 utterances through which God created the world in Bereshis, which are the what are they? Like, so God created the world through his speech. It's the speech of God, and this speech of God is the Shechina. So that's the end of this section. And so this leaves us with a much greater appreciation of this idea of how we know that God created and continues to create the world through his speech. So this is something that, you learn it really early on. It says, God said, let there be light. There was light, like in this story of Bereshis and the creation of the world. And we kind of get this feeling of, okay, God uses his speech to create that world. You kind of maybe picture this like being like speaking words into existence. But now we can have a much, much deeper appreciation of that, because what we're really saying is that what is speech? Speech is the manifestation of a person's intellect. And God's speech on its deepest level is what we call Malchus of Atzilus, Malchus of the highest world, which is otherwise known as the Shechina that we refer to all the time, the divine indwelling and everything. And so now what happens is that this Shechina, or this Malchus of Atzilus, descends from world to world to world to world, even down into our world, and causes this chain reaction, which creates all beings. And the way that this happens is that the Malchus of the higher world, whatever world we're talking about, descends into the next world and gets manifest and vested within the Chabad of that world, of that lower world, which is otherwise known as the Chamber of Holies of that world. And then that Chabad, or Chamber of Holies, becomes vested in the Malchus of that next world, which then in turn gets vested in the Chamber of Holies / Chabad of the next world, and so on and so forth. But it's the same Shechina that's descending from level to level to level, and it's the same Dvar Hashem. It's that the manifestation of God's speech, of God's mouth, of God's intellect, really, that's coming down here. So hopefully this can give you a little bit more of appreciation of God and of this idea of us relating to him as our king. That again, it's like just like with our parents, that we only see our parents in terms of their relationship with us, but there's like a whole bunch of other things that are going on behind the scenes that we don't see and that we don't know. But all of it came down and manifested in us, in them having a relationship with us. So too, as it is with God, that there's this whole chain of events, a whole bunch of different things that are going on. And all we see is our relationship with God. But there's a whole bunch of things that lead up to it constantly and perpetually. So that's it for today. And tomorrow we will begin a new chapter, chapter 53, which I believe is the last chapter of Likkutei Amarim. Very exciting. And then we're going to move on to a whole new sefer in this book. So stay tuned, and I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shechina. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.